To this evening's discussion. My name is Roshat Kasaba, and we are gathered here to, this is part of a series of conversations that we've been having in the school this year, and we have the general title of How to Make Sense of the World, and we focused on different topics and areas, and tonight we will discuss generally studying contentious issues like the Middle East in our classrooms. I'll just say a few words introducing the content of the panel and our speakers. So in general, in the Jackson School, when people ask us what we do, we say that we teach our students about the world. Now, what does that mean exactly? When you look at our courses, most of them are organized around major developments, processes, and problems that affect different regions of the world. Sometimes we teach courses that are broader in content, parts of world history, international relations in general, or we teach courses about global institutions that try to govern the world. Now, underlying many of our offerings and programs in the Jackson School, we have one common question and concern. And this question is, why is it that as the world becomes more closely linked and interrelated, the relations among people and communities become more contentious and conflict-ridden? There are a number of challenges we face as we take topics like this into our classroom and try to make sense of the world. First of all, of course, there's the question of scale. How do you bring the world into the classroom? You have to make certain choices, obviously, to make it manageable. Additionally, and unlike our colleagues in some other parts of this university, many of the topics that we deal with in our classes relate to our students' real-life experiences. And also, in parallel with the growing diversity of our society, our university and our students have also become increasingly diverse in recent years. We're likely to have immigrants in our classrooms, refugees, visitors, and foreign students. When I teach my course on Iraq War, it is very common that I'll have veterans in my class as well as Iraqi refugees. And it is also likely that some of the events that we call historical will be part of the experiences of the parents and grandparents of our students. Now, it's not really typical for dinner table conversations to include heated debates on calculus or algebra, but they're likely to revolve around various historical events, political leaders, wars, conflicts, and related problems. Our students grow up listening to these, of course. And let's face it now, while few people claim to be experts on DNA or human genome, just about everybody talks like an expert on nuclear treaties, on Islam, or the causes and consequences of World War II. So when it comes to the world, everybody knows and everybody is an expert. So when we have our students in our classrooms who come to us after growing up, listening to conversations with their families, with their friends, with their teachers, with their religious leaders and mentors. And they come to us also in recent years more and more after having been exposed to a growing barrage of media references and images. Now, some of what is in the media is right. Most of it is not quite accurate. And much of it reinforces many of the misinformation and stereotypes, they can be inflammatory or derogatory. And social media also has this interesting feature that it allows people only to listen to people that they agree with. And if you listen to people that you agree with enough, you also may end up believing that the US Army is about to occupy Texas, stage a coup d'etat, and then use Walmart as a concentration camp. I wish this was a joke. But so I think the point is our students don't come to our classes as blank slates. They come with some familiarity, knowledge, with some expectations, and sometimes with some misconceptions. And actually all this makes what we do very, very interesting and exciting for us. So what do we do in our classes? How do we teach about the world? How do we teach them without necessarily implying that everything else that they heard from everybody else is wrong? But at the same time, how do you get them to question their assumptions? See the new possibilities of thinking, and perhaps open new ways of imagining the world and the future. And most importantly, how do you encourage them to think for themselves without presenting our point of view as professors as the only correct point of view? Now, this is very tempting, especially for professors, but we have to be modest in our classrooms. And this last point is particularly challenging in many ways because not only the students, but obviously, as you can see from our panel, our faculty has also become increasingly diverse in recent years. So what we try to do in the Jackson School is what a good liberal arts education that deals with some of the most contentious issues of our times should do everywhere at this university. So what appears in a way as a challenge and difficulty can become a very important opportunity. So teaching about the world may not be as easy as teaching calculus, but we all love what we do, and that's why, in addition to a full day's work, we are here tonight to talk about what we do. And I'm speaking for myself, but I think also for my colleagues, there isn't really anything else that we would rather be doing in our lives. So we feel very, very fortunate. So what we'll do tonight is we'll touch on some of these issues by hearing from our colleagues, by focusing primarily on the Middle East. But I assure you, we could have an exactly similar kind of panel on China and Japan relations, China-Taiwan relations, Turkey-Greek relations, Armenian genocide, in short, anything that you can think of that is now important about the world history and today. So what I will do is I will introduce now our speakers, and I will ask them each to speak maybe for about 10 minutes, and then we will open it up for questions and comments. We hope that this is a conversation, so feel free if you have some thoughts that you want to express, but don't go too long, but because we have limited time and we want to be as inclusive as we can. And we will try to wrap it up by about 8:45 so that we can all go home at night. So I will introduce our panelists and then have them make their presentations. The first speaker is Sarah Curran. Sarah Curran is Associate Professor in the Jackson School of International Studies, and she's also the Director of our Center for Global Studies. And in that capacity, she oversees the largest undergraduate major in the Jackson School, and she has been involved thinking about the pedagogical issues of building and expanding, actually, a very successful undergraduate major in the College of Arts and Sciences. She's a sociologist by training, and her area of expertise is migration and refugee studies, focusing primarily on Southeast Asia. Next is Joel Migdal. He's a new addition to our faculty. Robert F. Feld, Professor of International Studies, one of the most distinguished names in political science in general and Middle East studies in particular. Joel has published a number of numerous books and articles. His most book is on U.S. policy in the Middle East, and he is also the director of PhD program in Near and Middle East Studies. Devin Nahr is J. and Marsha Glazer Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies, Assistant Professor in Jackson School and the Department of History. He's also the Director of Sephardic Studies program in the Jackson School, and as many of you know, in the relatively short period of time that Devin has been with us, he has already built one of the richest and really excellent, best collections of sources on Sephardic studies anywhere in the country and perhaps anywhere in the world. So very grateful for Devin's work. And Devin has just finished a book focusing on Salonika as it moved through the Ottoman Empire into the Greek nation, and focusing specifically on the Jewish community in that city. And the last is Arzu Osanlu. Arzu is an associate professor in Law, Societies, and Justice program. She has a JD and a PhD in anthropology. JD is not in anthropology, but a JD. And Arzu has a book that deals with women's status and gender issues in Iranian law, and she is now working on a project that sort of looks at issues of forgiveness in Islamic law in Iran. And in addition to her many accomplishments, Arzu is also will become next year the director of the Middle East Center in the Jackson School. Unfortunately, our last speaker, Hamza Zafer, cannot be with us because of a family emergency. He is flying back east. Hopefully we will have him in future panels. So thank you all for coming. So I will turn to Sarah.
Okay. Joel says I have to stand up, and what Joel says goes. Okay. So, just a minute, let me get myself set up here. Okay, can everybody hear me? It's all valuable anyway. I'm going to talk to you today. Thank you, Rashad. I'm going to talk to you today mostly as a sociologist, and mostly from earlier, tell you a little bit more, build on my own stories from my past, and that have informed the way I think about learning and teaching in higher education. I won't be talking specifically about the Middle East, but what I'd like to do today is offer a few ways in which to maybe think about learning and what we mean particularly about critical thinking and critical learning. So as I sat down to write out my reflections on the subject of pedagogies of courage and controversy, I kept landing on two sets of ideas around knowledge and skills that frequently get bandied about in my contemporary world, but are always put into conversation with each other, but which aren't always put into conversation with each other per se, in particular critical thinking and global citizenship. And I would argue that one can't happen without the other. And so I want to spend a little bit of most of my time actually discussing what we mean by critical thinking, and a little bit less on the latter item, global citizenship, and I'll just draw a few connections at the end. So as I said, my remarks are meant to offer some framing and a perspective on approaches to teaching that might facilitate thoughtful and productive learning around such sensitive topics as those found in the Middle East and are profoundly necessary over the next few years, particularly. But first, how did I get to the title of my, do I get from the title of my remarks, Pedagogies of Controversy, Courage and Controversy, to these ideas of critical thinking and global citizenship? And for me, it really begins with thinking about what does it mean to build capabilities and courageousness. My answer draws on my own teaching, as I said, in sociology, especially with regards to gender, race, poverty, immigration, and development. Okay. You can't hear me in the back? Sorry, thank you. Let's see if I can get the volume.
Put it in the front.
Let's see. Yeah. Okay, is that better?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Devin. Thank you, Bill. Okay. I'm not going to rehash what I said, but I want to just talk about how we can think about taking courageous stands and building the capability to take courageous stands in the classroom amongst our students, and thereby build their skill sets as they go out in the world to become effective global citizens and leaders. And I'm going to be speaking about my own experiences in teaching about controversial topics in sociology, especially mainstream sociology. But let me offer a bit of my own history, a story. In my junior year as an undergraduate, I took the brave step of seeking to register in a graduate level course in the School of Natural Resources at the University of Michigan, where I was a major. I met the professor in his office to ask his permission, and we briefly chatted. I suppose I came across as eager and engaged. He seemed friendly and open. All seemed quite like the normal expectations, although I was nervous about joining a graduate level class. The class was to address class, gender, race, and environmental justice. After the first day of the class, I knew that I was going to experience learning in a wholly new and profound way. He did two things on that first day, and they are forever seared in my memory. First, he told us that as long as we did the readings, participated in class discussions, and wrote our papers, we would all get a B. That's it. No one who accomplished those benchmarks should expect more or less. The point of the class was not about the grade. The second thing he asked us to do was to write our class educational race, family background characteristics on a 5x7 card, and then pin that card on our backs. And then the class of 15 graduate and a few undergraduates then walked around the room reading each other's backs. We then discussed the symbolism of that act, the meaningfulness of those categories, and our own varied histories and experiences. And I was completely blown away by the experience, owning my own history, feeling for others' histories and understanding those, and thinking about the objective and subjective categories from day one of that class meant that we approached the critical topic of environmental justice with personal responsibility to earn each other's respect and maintain each other's dignity, while still owning our own voice and making an argument. This lesson has stayed with me as I've matured in my own teaching and learning. So my early intellectual childhood was at the time of the culture wars, the emergence of multiculturalism and the postmodern turn in social science. And these avenues that were opened up for learning and research at that time were those that allowed for greater equality inside the classroom, empowering challenges to the status quo, the social categories that had ordered our lives, encouraging the flourishing of new trans identities and intersectionalities, the opening up of many black boxes for interrogation and revelation, and the uncovering of hidden powers of discourse and voice. At the same time, those very same openings presented challenges. The challenge of learning and research that emerged from those times was the challenge of being able to say something authoritatively and authentically from one's particular standpoint and in relation to the many other claims that were to be simultaneously privileged. As with any paradigmatic shift, it was both liberating and disconcerting. So while conducting so we'll flash forward a bit to my PhD. While conducting my PhD research in the very empirical world of demography, which is my training, I also found myself in the field living with and in dialogue with villagers in Thailand who completely disrupted my discipline's ordering of relationships. Furthermore, I found that the figurative ground under my feet often gave way as I questioned myself, my authority, and authenticity, as well as my own capability to honorably interpret their own stories. While completing the dissertation is always an immense relief, and my committee lauded my unpacking of categories and empiricism through narrative accounts, it still felt uncomfortable. How might the villagers who told me their narratives have interpreted their personal encounter with numbers? Of course, many contemporary ethnographers ask themselves such questions, and while this anecdote may sound entirely off-topic and irrelevant from what you want to hear, what I'd like to observe about it in particular is that it was a lesson in critical thinking that has stayed with me ever since. The awesome power of my privilege and responsibility for observing, recording, and interpreting the humanities of a particular people at a particular time in a particular place. And the acuteness of that reflection has only grown with time as I read accounts of social scientists who traversed that very same particular landscape in the 1970s and recorded villagers' lives as part of projects for the US government to better understand insurgency movements. And those kinds of exercises continue today. And as I return time and again to those villages and observe their residents experiencing considerable political and economic turmoil, I have also observed that they have been the subject of ongoing social science investigation, news accounts, and much else, oftentimes simultaneously caricaturized, vilified, victimized, and valorized as they've been pushed and pulled into pro- and anti-government political movements. Now they are wary and careful of outsiders. And let me say again, we hold an awesome power and responsibility for this, our capacity as social scientists for observing, recording, and interpreting these humanities of a particular people at a particular time in a particular place. And we have similar responsibilities inside the classroom. So now let me turn to the more specific point. As I joined the ranks of faculty at a higher education institution, not this one when I first started, I confronted an irony inside the classroom. Whether I was teaching about race, gender, immigration, or development, the silencing of critical thinking was deafening. While both my students and I were a product of those times that broke open critical thinking, we treaded gingerly around controversial topics, disciplined by political correctness, and careful not to make any assumptions about standpoints. For a host of other likely reasons, students were urgently grade worried and anxious to please their instructor. The question soon arose, how do I teach in such a way as to bring out their voices and overcome the silence? And furthermore, how do I empower them to realize that they also can teach us all how to tackle highly politicized topics that tend to divide and can be socially regressive rather than progressive? In the case of my particular classrooms where I confronted these silences, the controversial topics were abortion, prejudice, illegal immigration, and racism. While we are often told that we should be teaching critical thinking skills, we are rarely explicitly taught how to do so. I spent some time unpacking the idea of critical thinking skills and have a few rules of thumb when I'm thinking about learning around controversial topics, and I'd like to share them with you. The first is, and these are three pillars in which I think it's very important that we integrate these into our classroom teaching. The first is teach students to systematically inquire and reflect. 2, empower students to make an original reasoned argument. And 3, require compassion and imagination. Such an approach builds their capacity to be courageous and ethically tackle controversial topics. So what do these 3 pillars mean in real life and in the classroom? Well, on the first one, teaching students to systematically inquire and reflect, is not so surprising. It's just what you would expect in an academic setting. This is the careful pursuit of the full suite of arguments and evidences, but it also requires the reflection in not only whether the full set of conceptions and counterfactuals have been considered, but making choices about relevancy and problem solving. And it's making those choices that's very important. For example, when discussing abortion patterns and trends, we discuss prior expectations and then uncover the realities of patterns, which then evokes a discussion about social facts. The second also follows closely, that is, empower students to make an original reasoned argument, but hinges critically on the idea of originality and reasoning. The former requires ethical distinctions between one's own ideas and others, Holding students true to these distinctions is key to developing their capabilities, and it takes courageous teaching to hold them accountable. The latter also hinges on a moral logic of the argument and the unmeasurable and unobservable assumptions upon which it usually must rest, especially true in the social sciences. Again, the challenge for teaching is allowing and acknowledging the statement of the unknowable and unobservable assumptions by students. So particularly in the case of abortion, this is very challenging. Here we have, one can have a lot of fairly reasoned, sound arguments and original arguments, but one of the challenges is that oftentimes the assumption that comes into it is a belief system. And it's a belief system that varies across people, and it's one that one has to acknowledge and care for, and then allow for the relevancy and value of the reasoned argument in that case. The third is perhaps the hardest, and one we often shy away from in an objective classroom setting, and it requires personal maturity and social maturity. Compassion and imagination require taking the risk of fully revealing oneself and learning about others, as well as imagining yourself in their place at their time. Respect for one's own identities, histories, cultures, and those of others can enable productive intellectual collaborations. Again, in the case of abortion, this means understanding the place and context for a decision and recognizing the structures of power and constraints that may have limited personal responsibilities and freedoms. Building on these ideas, students can, growing these three pillars of capabilities, become aware of their real possibilities through critical reflection and self-reflection, and very importantly, they learn to identify assumptions and envision alternative possibilities, like the ones that were suggested by Rashad. I would now argue that these capabilities mean that the young people that practice and strengthen them will have, as some have argued, the capabilities to critically address political problems, to articulate one's view and defend them before people with whom one disagrees, and in turn have demonstrated the very value of a form of moral education to which higher education should be one of the places where this takes place. Martha Nussbaum has articulated this very clearly, and I think that it articulates the standpoint from which one builds global citizenship. Nussbaum says, failure to think critically produces a democracy in which we talk at one another but never have a genuine dialogue. In such an atmosphere, bad arguments pass for good arguments, and prejudice can all too easily masquerade as reason. To unmask prejudice and secure justice, we need argument. And it's an essential tool for civic freedom.
Thank you, Sarah. Can you hear me in the back there? Okay, so I'm going to start with a little confession. And the confession is that I'd really much rather talk about the Middle East than talk about talking about the Middle East. So I'm going to start by reconstructing an argument that we had in my seminar today. And it was about nationalism. Nationalism, which really gained force in the 19th century and into the 20th century, had as part of its program the creation of homogeneous citizens. And the creation of homogeneous citizens was, in a sense, a new concept in politics. It meant, as I'll come back to in a second, the demonization of those who fell outside the nationalist framework. Now, why was this new? In the empires that existed in Europe and the Middle East before nationalism took hold, there were still sharp demarcations between us and them, between a person and the other. There were very distinct social boundaries of different sects, religions, tribal groups, ethnic groups, all sorts of things. And there certainly wasn't love among these groups, but if not love, there was a certain acceptance. An acceptance of the plurality of the empires, the existence of these empires as umbrellas which encompass lots of different peoples. What nationalism did as it took hold in the late 19th century, this is too loud, and in the 20th century, was delegitimate or delegitimize the acceptance of the other, the acceptance of the plurality of societies. It delegitimized the plurality and gave a new dangerous meaning to other groups in the society. Now this very quick survey of nationalism, I want to say had an effect not only on the peoples of the world, the Serbs and the Croatians, the Palestinians and the Israelis, the Iraqis and the Syrians and so on. It had an effect on history, historians, academics as well. As time went on, the national narrative became the exclusive story. It became the narrative not only of nationalists, but of academics as well. And the stories of a different kind of space, a plural space, was somehow pushed out and suppressed. Now, I grew up on these nationalist histories. This is what I had in college, this is what I had in graduate school. And then I came across a number of works which really startled me. They shouldn't have startled me, but they did. Let me talk about a couple of them. One, the very first, was a book by Albert Memmi called The Pillar of Salt. Pillar of Salt. Anybody here haven't read that? Yeah, about 3 of you. Okay, 4. It's a great novel, and it's a personal novel. It's really about himself. Although the protagonist, Memmi, doesn't call himself Memmi there, is actually highly unlikable in the novel. Did you find that too? Yeah. But what struck me about this novel was about him as a young Jewish boy, growing up in a neighborhood of Tunis. He later went on to be a great French philosopher, but he grew up in this neighborhood of Tunis. And what startled me about the book was this description of Tunis that he gave. It was like nothing I had ever heard before. He said that there were so many dialects that people on one block did not understand the people on the next block, even if they were from the same so-called ethnic group. There was a tremendous diversity of ways of speaking, ways of thinking, identity, who people were. Now, he saw all this in a kind of negative light. The book is about his escaping this parochial background. But to me, it showed something else entirely. It showed a world in which the so-called Arab nationalist story, that was the story that I had read in so many books, was not holding true. It was somehow being complicated by what he wrote. A more recent book did very much the same for Cairo, and that was Andre Aciman's Out of Egypt. Anybody read that? More people have read that. That's a really good book, and I recommend it strongly. It's a personal memoir, again, of a Jew. In fact, all these people are Jews here, that I have for you, who grew up in 1950s Cairo, and again, talked about the place of his family, other Jewish families, their relationship to the larger context of Cairo. These were people who did not speak Arabic, but lived in the midst of Cairo very comfortably for generations, who held passports from a variety of countries, Italy, France, Ottoman Empire, It was a diversity and a kind of mosaic to the city that was totally unrecognizable to one who's read recent histories of Cairo. And Lucette, I don't know how you say her name exactly, Lagnado, who's a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, wrote a similar book about Alexandria called The Man in the White Sharkskin Suit. Anybody read that one? That's good. Which made very much the same kind of argument. And even recently, I read a memoir, or sort of memoir, by Ariel Sabar called My Father's Paradise. How about that? Good. Naomi Sokoloff has read every book that I mentioned. She's amazing. Which again is about an area, Iraq, which had been overtaken by the 1980s by a nationalist mentality, the notion of the Arab nationalism and Iraqi nationalism sewn together, which really had no place for these Aramaic-speaking Kurdish Jews who lived on the margins of society and really didn't fit into that narrative at all, and whose history was written out of the books and out of the curricula and out of the school systems. So all this leads me to talk now about teaching about the Middle East today, and specifically about Palestinians and Israelis. The Arabs of Palestine and the early Zionists who came to the Ottoman Empire from the 1880s on confronted each other first in that plural atmosphere that I talked about. And histories of Jerusalem of the time really reflect the kind of rich tapestry, the rich mosaic that existed in that city as Jews and Arabs and others interacted with each other. But even during that time, during the late Ottoman Empire, already the nationalist stories were beginning to take hold. First among the Jews, and the strong sense of nationalism that permeated Zionism, and then through the Palestinians, the Arabs, who, partly in reaction to Zionism, but partly because of broader things happening in the Arab world, began to develop their own nationalist story. And these stories began to leave little room for the other, little room for the kind of Jerusalem that existed in the latter decades of the 19th century. Now, I titled my talk here tonight, I didn't give you the title at the beginning, Empathy Without Sympathy is the name of it. And let me say what I'm intending with this. My intent in teaching is to get away from the suppression or delegitimation of the other's story or narrative. I may abhor the Islamic State and their acts of brutality. I do abhor. But as an academic, or even as a citizen, I want to get into the heads of the Islamic State members and leaders. What are they thinking? How do they rationalize what they do? What motivates them to do it? In other words, what is their story? What is their narrative? How do they understand their place in the world and their place in history? My goals in teaching on Israel and Palestine are first, to recognize the existence of multiple stories, ones that often clash on even the most fundamental facts, and particularly on values and aspirations. What are these stories? Even within the story of each nationalist movement, there are contradictions, there are conflicts, there are all kinds of tensions. What are those tensions? How do they work themselves out? What do they mean today? Some of the Palestinian story and some of the Zionist story, Israeli story, overlap in form, if not in substance, certainly not in substance. So there is a sense in the Palestinian story of victimhood, of displacement, of kind of the sons of the soil being moved out from their homes and from their legacies. And similarly, on the Israeli or Zionist side, there is a sense of displacement, of return to a land that they had been exiled from, of the sense of trauma that we see in the Palestinian Nakba, reflected in part in the Jewish relationship to the Holocaust. But in many ways, these stories also differ in their form. And the stories are complex and difficult to unravel. So the first thing I try to have students to do is to understand that there are different stories. And second, whatever the sympathies of the students, and many of them have strong sympathies, try to penetrate those stories. That is, not to have sympathy, but to have empathy, to understand what are they thinking? How do they rationalize what they're doing? What motivates them? What's their story? Third, I try to get them to understand the stories as not coherent narratives, but as ones that are the product of struggles within each story and how the struggle between the stories has affected each of the stories. And finally, to be able to analyze all these, whether they are ones you love or loathe, you've got to be able to step back a bit. You want to have compassion. You want to have passion. You don't necessarily want to upset the student's understanding of who they are or what their sympathies are. But you do want them to get to reflect, think critically, as Sarah said, about not only their own narratives, but the narratives of the others. So I'm going to conclude with a longish anecdote. So, and you'll forgive me because it's very self-centered, this anecdote. What can I do? So in the late 1980s, a wonderful man came to the Jackson School. His name was Baruch Timmerling. He was a fantastic sociologist, Israeli sociologist. And he said to me at the end of his stay, let's write a book. Let's write a book on the Palestinians. Now, we thought a lot about this. Why should two Jews, one an American, one an Israeli, write a book on the Palestinians, after all? And we thought a lot about our audience, and it turned out our audience was actually quite diverse. The book was used in courses, and it was used by academics. It was translated into 2 different Arabic editions. So obviously it was being used by the Arab population. But I think in the backs of our minds, not only in the backs of our minds, we talked about it, our principal audience was Israeli Jews and American Jews. What we wanted to do with this book was precisely what I was saying a moment ago, was to try, not to sympathize with, but to understand that narrative that was going on. Now, Baruch, I have to say a word about Baruch because he was a fantastic person, and he, in some ways, revolutionized the study of sociology in Israel. Up until Baruch, the way sociology was studied, particularly the sociology of the Jews, was to look at the Jews as a kind of picking themselves up by the bootstraps, coming from this difficult conditions in Europe and in Africa and Asia, and creating this wonderful state, which they did. And Baruch said, that's not enough. You have to understand that Israeli Jews have been formed by their interaction with the Palestinians. In some ways you can call that the conflict. Partly it is, but he meant something even broader than the conflict. That the very interaction of Jews and Palestinians created what the Jews are today. So that's the background of that, and we really thought that in some ways we wanted to bring that to the Israeli public and to the Jewish American public, bring that interaction and bring their story because it has been such a central component of the Jews' own story. If I'm making myself clear here. So we wrote the book, and it came out in just as the Oslo Accords were being signed in 1993, and it raised a storm in Israel, partly in the United States too, certain magazines, but mostly in Israel. And a very famous writer, Aharon Megid, attacked it quite viciously, and this began a series of articles in almost every newspaper in Israel on this book. I have to say, well, I'll get to that in a minute. So, Baruch wrote me, and Baruch, I once introduced Baruch as a person who never had found a fight that he didn't want to pick. And so he wrote me, and he said, answer them. And I said, that's not my style. I write what I write. They can do with it what they want. They can have all the arguments they want. He said, well, it's not my style. And he dived into these arguments in what was then in the newspaper Davar, Haaretz, Ma'ariv. It was all over the place. He loved it. Now, the claim that was lodged against us, the central claim that was lodged against us was that we were delegitimizing Israel by telling the Palestinian narrative and delving into it and analyzing it, seeing where it came from and how it developed and what its components were. We were in fact delegitimizing the Zionist or Israeli narrative. About a year later, Baruch tried to get the book translated into Hebrew. And it had already been translated, the first translation into Arabic. And he kept writing me, no one will publish this book. No one will publish this book. I didn't believe him. I thought he was just being ineffective. I went to Israel and I talked to publishers. No one would publish the book. About a year after that, so we're talking about 1995, the most famous publisher in Israel came to Baruch and said, we want to publish this book. And I was trying to figure out what happened here. So they published it. It was published in Hebrew. And for the first and only time in my life, I was on a bestseller list. Number 10 on the Israeli bestseller list. This was quite something, let me tell you. And the reviews came out. And it was like night and day. The vitriol that we had faced in 1994, now by the end of 1995 and 1996 was gone. And there were reviews that were titled things like, read about our neighbors. And I thought, what happened here? Well, I'm not sure exactly what happened. Part of it was that the Oslo Accords had in fact led to some rethinking by Israelis on how Palestinians and Israelis may coexist and therefore need to know each other's narratives. I'd like to think also that the book itself taught people something, who knows. But the case is, I think, that in certain circumstances, and the university classroom is one of them, you can move away from the vitriol and move towards a penetration of the narrative, even of the other. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. My remarks will resonate, I think, with what's been said so far, and especially with Joel's comments. I wanted to start by throwing out a few terms that we hear when we speak about the Middle East, and especially Israel and Palestine. Jew, Arab, Israeli, Palestinian, colonizer, colonized, European, indigenous. These are some of the terms that frame our discussions about the Israel-Palestinian conflict today. We encounter these terms in the news, and we encounter them on campus. These are, I think, quite essentialized dichotomies. They're polarities. They're binaries that frame the discussion. They're the antonyms that separate the us from the them, that turn each into the other's enemy, that produce mutually exclusive identities that seem somehow both natural and irreconcilable. So as an historian, I see one of my first tasks to be sensitize my students to the nature in which these categories come about, how the vocabularies that we use have not been in existence like that since time immemorial, and that they, like the people to whom they refer, transform over time, involve protracted and complicated processes, and that the terms that frame this discussion are anything but ancient, but rather, as Joel alluded to, quite recent vintage. The Ottoman Empire, including in Israel and Palestine, these ideas of national affiliation, as Joel mentioned, for many centuries were largely inconceivable. As Rashad has mentioned in much of his work, we ought not to conceptualize the Ottoman Empire as a kind of a prison of nations, despite what today's nationalists in that region would like us to believe. Theirs was not a world of Arabs and Jews, but a world of Muslims, of Christians, and of Jews, a world in which religious affiliations in particular numbered among the most salient features of one's identity as an individual and as part of a kind of a community. And into the 20th century, Palestine's Muslims, Christians, and Jews even came to embrace each other, however momentarily, as Ottoman brothers. But the subsequent hardening of nationalist ideologies, the ruptures of war, of European colonialism, of anti-colonial movements, contributed to what some refer to as the unmixing of peoples, also a prolonged process that separated out the Jew from the Arab, that did so in such a seemingly definitive way that we sometimes are easily convinced that that's how it always was. Now I want to give you two examples that can shake up some of those assumptions, similar to some of these memoirs that you mentioned, or novels that you mentioned, Joel. Examples that I think we can bring also to our students to give them a sense of some of the complexities at play, and to bring in some gray into a story that oftentimes seems black and white. The first is the case of Muhammad Ruhi al-Khalidi, of the famed Khalidi family of Jerusalem. He was a scion of this family, by the way, is Rashid Khalidi, who was a prominent scholar and activist at Columbia University. The older al-Khalidi, who lived a century ago, would today be characterized, you might say, as a Palestinian intellectual, but likely thought of himself as an Arab, as an Arabic-speaking Ottoman Muslim. He received a traditional Islamic education. He actually attended a Jewish school for a short time, and he continued his education in Paris. In some ways, he bridged the world of tradition and modernity. He bridged the world between Europe and the Middle East. Among his many pursuits in the intellectual arena, he sought to understand the relationship between his own community and Jews, and as well as Jews' relationship to Palestine. And in 1913, just before World War I, Al-Khalidi composed a lengthy treatise in Arabic about Jews and Zionism. And there's a really interesting new book that I would recommend to you that tells this story in quite a lot of detail, called Defining Neighbors by Jonathan Grivitz at Princeton. And contrary to what we might expect, and this is where it's really interesting, Al-Khalidi argued that Jews were not foreigners in Palestine. On the contrary, he argued that Jews were native to Palestine, that it was their original homeland, that even after being dispersed from Jerusalem for 2 millennia, Jews retained great affinity for the land, and one they hoped to return. For Al-Khalidi, Zionism was not a modern invention, but rather a biblical commandment that had rendered Jerusalem holy to Jews even before it was holy for Muslims and Christians. But he pointed to 2 phenomena to argue why Palestine no longer belonged to the Jews. And this is also quite interesting and very creative. First, because Arabs, by which he means Muslims, conquered the land, not from Jews, but from Byzantines. And so, nothing was owed to the Jews at this time. Secondly, since all across Europe and even in the Ottoman Empire, Jews had gained rights as citizens in the countries in which they lived. They had experienced emancipation. They had therefore forfeited their status as a nation. They had become a religious group instead. And they thereby relinquished their right to national political sovereignty in Palestine. Interesting interpretation of history. But Al-Khalidi comes across one problem that he couldn't resolve, and we see his struggles about this issue in his treatise on Jews and Zionism. Due to the rise of exclusionary anti-Semitism across Europe that rolled back the introduction of civil rights for Jews, he feared that Jews now were in the process of becoming a nation again. And ultimately, he feared that they would seek to return to the land that he agreed was once theirs, and that this would create a big problem for him and his community. Unable to reconcile his desire to express empathy, and I think he did, for the victims of anti-Semitism, with his desire to prevent Jews from returning to Palestine, Al-Khalidi concluded on quite an ambivalent note. He actually wound up drawing on well-known anti-Semitic stereotypes, perhaps some that he absorbed in his time in France. He was there during the Dreyfus affair. He wound up arguing that by focusing on the selfish accumulation of wealth for themselves alone, this is what he says, in the realms of finance and in commerce, Jews had brought about a justifiable hatred against them. And this is sort of where he leaves his story about Jews and Zionism. Left struggling actually, with a number of different aspects here. So we have a leading Palestinian intellectual from a century ago grappling with his belief in the legitimacy of Jews' historic claims to Palestine and his own desire and current situation in which he sought to prevent Jewish migration to that very same land. So it's a complex, it's a contradictory, it's an ambivalent tale, a tale also, like the ones that Joel mentioned, that are occluded or marginalized or omitted from the repertoire of stories we normally hear. A second kind of story that's also included from our vision of the Middle East is the story of the Arab Jew, or the Jewish Arab, or even the Palestinian Jew. These were terms, by the way, that existed and were used certainly through World War II. Ottoman Palestine had been home to a tapestry of Jewish communities. There was a long-standing Arabic-speaking Jewish population, Ladino-speaking Sephardic Jews who had lived there since 1492. There were Moroccan Jews, there were Syrian Jewish Syrian Jewish communities, all of whom were Ottomans. And they were joined by a newer crop of Eastern European, primarily Yiddish-speaking Jews, some Zionists and some not. Throughout the Ottoman world, throughout the Arab world more broadly, in fact, Jewish communities flourished. One great example is Baghdad. There, Jews traced their roots, as they understood it, back to the Babylonian era. And by the turn of the 20th century, there were a very large proportion of Baghdad's urban population. They understood themselves and thought about themselves as Jews, but also as Arabs. They were also Ottomans. They were Baghdadis. They soon became Iraqis. But the same processes of unmixing of the populations that I mentioned before, of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the imposition of colonial rule, British colonial rule, independence movements, anti-Semitism intersecting with these processes, the mass murder of Europe's Jews during the Holocaust, the ultimate creation of the State of Israel, the concomitant displacement of nearly 750,000 of Palestinians in the Nakba that Joel referred to before, and subsequently the expulsion of approximately the same amount, maybe as many as 800,000 Jews from Arab countries. This was a series of calamities, interrelated, but distinct calamities that provoked the parting of the ways between Jews and Arabs. Or more aptly, the invention, the creation of the idea of the Arab and the idea of the Jew as two distinct figures. The very category of the Arab Jew, or the Jewish Arab, dissolved. To attune us to the impossibility of this very idea of the Arab Jew in the wake of these processes and transformations, we can draw on the writings of one scholar who is also a political activist, who is still today, who has some political views, some of which I sympathize with, others not necessarily, but what she has to say on this topic I think is very important, and that is Ella Shohat, who's a professor of cultural studies at NYU. In a number of essays that she started writing in the 80s and into the 90s, she describes often finding herself obliged to explain the mysteries of what she and the people she interacts with perceive to be her oxymoronic identity, as she described it. An identity that's been excised, as Joel also alluded to, from Arab narratives and marginalized from Zionist Jewish narratives. And here she writes in one such essay, "I'm an Arab Jew, or more specifically, an Iraqi-Israeli woman living, writing, and teaching in the United States. When my grandmother first encountered Israeli society in the 50s, she was convinced that the people who looked, spoke, and ate so differently, the European Jews, were actually European Christians. Jewishness, for her generation, was inextricably associated with Middle Easternness. My grandmother, who still lives in Israel and still communicates largely in Arabic, had to be taught, this is very important, had to be taught to speak of us as Jews and them as Arabs. For Middle Easterners, the operating distinction had always been Muslim, Jew, and Christian, not Arab versus Jew. The assumption was that Arabness referred to a common shared culture and language, albeit with religious differences. She calls, and has been calling for some decades now, for what she refers to as an end to the binarisms of war, an end to a simplistic charting of Middle Eastern identities. I think that exposure to these kinds of perspectives, a Palestinian intellectual convinced of Jews' historic claims to Palestine, but fearful of their return, and an Arab Jewish woman, an intellectual, an American and Israeli, seeking to cope with the transformation of her and her family's identity into a paradox, seeking to cope with the resulting, as she refers to it, visceral schizophrenia that came out of it. These kinds of stories, I think, if we bring them to our students, can help them, they can help us break down some of these essentialized dichotomies that have framed our discussion. Remind us that other combinations and constellations were once possible, that aspirations for different futures may also require different pasts. Thanks.
microphone sounds pretty loud to me. Can you guys hear me okay? Yes? Well, thank you for coming this evening. I have a confession of my own to make, and that is I don't teach Middle East studies. I don't actually teach a course, an area studies topic. As Rashad said early on, I'm an anthropologist. My training is in law and anthropology. So I come to you with some insights from that perspective. And I wanted to start my comments with a quote from Clifford Geertz, one of the founding fathers of modern interpretive anthropology. And in his classic text, The Interpretation of Cultures, Geertz examined his interest in moving to this integrative model, what we call this interpretive approach to cultures. And he says, nothing will discredit a semiotic approach to culture more quickly than allowing it to drift into a combination of intuitionism and alchemy, no matter how elegantly the intuitions are expressed or modern alchemy is made to look. The danger that cultural analysis will lose touch with the hard surfaces of life, with the political, economic, stratificatory realities within which men everywhere are contained, and with the biological and physical necessities on which those surfaces rest, is an ever-present one. The only defense against it, and thus against turning cultural analysis into a kind of sociological aestheticism, is to train this analysis on such realities and such necessities in the first place, to look at the symbolic dimensions of social action, art, religion, ideology, science, law, morality, common sense, is not to turn away from the existential dilemmas of human life. It is to plunge in the midst of them. And that's a bit of a dense quote, but I have to say that's one of my inspirations for turning to anthropology as a lawyer. I was struck by some of the things that were missing in my own sort of unilinear disciplinary training. And so in my work, in my teaching, I bring law and society studies and anthropological insights, but they are inspired by what I saw as a lawyer. So it was the practice of law that got me interested in cultural analysis in the first place. It was working as an immigration lawyer and getting quite a lot of success representing Iranian asylum seekers, where sometimes I wouldn't even know quite what questions to ask, and the judge would intervene and ask those questions, and I would win my case. But it wasn't the same with the Egyptian client who was tortured in prison under Mubarak, who lost his case. It wasn't the same with the Palestinian client who was told that the 1951 convention does not apply to Palestinians. It was not the case to my Chinese client who converted to Catholicism when the judge brought in a Bible and tested him on his knowledge of the sacraments. The judge was a very strict Italian Catholic. I should have known better in that case. But it was only after I practiced that I was able to observe there were certain things missing in my kind of naive understanding of the law. It was this absent any real consideration for the way politics and history shape legal practice. And I bring this observation into my own research and teaching today. So as things stand in my department, it's an interdisciplinary department. It's called Law, Societies, and Justice. And I teach a variety of courses that focus on law and society, law and society studies. They're all interdisciplinary, but they do not focus on area studies. And in my courses that do have some Middle East subject matter, I gather interdisciplinary insights from law and society studies and anthropology and apply them to the Middle East, and in some cases to Iran. And I see my teaching as a broader component of broader research. It permits the opportunity to work collaboratively with students who, for me, provide an important touchstone of Iran in particular, and a region that is very poorly understood. I can see the knowledge that they have, the attitudes that they have, and they have changed over time. And it's oftentimes the questions that the students bring to the class that actually trigger my own research interests. So teaching about Iran is important, but I've learned it requires deep contextualization that American students often don't have. And part of the reason for this is 36 years of no diplomatic relations. But also, a line from an article I read today, propaganda masquerading as objective analysis through many readily available venues that actually block real debate and discussion on the issues. But our knowledge, my knowledge, is also situated. And so we must situate that knowledge before our students and sort of lay out how we came to know what we know. So in addition to teach Iran, to teach about Iran, I sense that we also need to defy it. We need to defy the idea of teaching about Iran as if it were an isolated country whose internal politics are free from the pressures and concerns of the world outside. Iran is shaped by its relations with others, with other countries. And the point is, how can one isolate one country through scholarship, through the academic setting? And that's, to me, the very opposite of what social science research should be doing. So I don't want my students to perceive the world in this way either. And by working on law and human rights, in fact, I seek to say something about the categories, as much about the categories of law and human rights as I do about Iran or the Middle East or any particular country. I also seek to show that the realities in Iran reflect how it is part of the world in which we all live, and how those realities are in part shaped by broader issues, the global economy, politics, and even social movements outside of Iran. So to offer research about Iran through my work, I also seek to provide insight on the rest of the world as well. When it comes to teaching on Iran in particular, I think it's fruitful also to recognize and inform our students of the contentious histories of the modern disciplines, particularly my discipline, anthropology. And as well, area studies approaches that followed this imperial project of dividing the world's resources and communities into controllable units. So my work, and in consequence my teaching, takes this as a starting point that aims to show a history of the present, or the how of how we know what we know, and how we take certain conditions to be truths or facts, which are more accurately compressed and ossified processes that are now presented as facts. Even the fact of the United Nations Charter, the Security Council, the Security Council resolutions, which are law, in fact. So in my mind, the classroom should be a place for enabling the broad conversations and cultivating a range of interlocutors, both interdisciplinary, but also outside voices to come into the classroom. Usually when I teach courses, these broad courses that range from topics like the culture and practice of human rights to women's rights in Muslim societies, or a course on refugees, I actually try to bring in insights from different disciplines: anthropology, Middle East studies, law, gender studies, Islamic studies even. And from the standpoint of serving students and the public, I seek to make current issues and debates legible. And by that, what I mean is I want to provide the students the skills and training to better understand the complexities of the Middle East, to place those issues in historical, social, economic, and political contexts. But also, I want to highlight, especially with regard to Iran, that there are internal debates going on in these regions, within the societies themselves, whether it's about women's rights, whether it's about the death penalty, a topic that I've worked on in Iran. So I try to develop courses that provide analytical training, but also substantive learning about the subjects in the Middle East region. I seek to move away from a singular focus on text, which equates the region or the country with Islam, or flattens the entire broad-based interdisciplinary study of Middle East studies to Islam, and try to avoid presenting just one narrative that focuses on spectacular events. As an anthropologist, I'm particularly interested in the daily lives of people, the humdrum events, how people live with the constraints of the societies that they're living in. So, given these concerns, let me say more concretely, I'm interested in building programming that treats the region broadly, that addresses diversity within the region, that does not reduce it to the Arab or so-called Muslim world. As somebody interested in Iran, obviously, I'm interested in broadening that discussion. And I would like to show linkages both within the region and with that part of the world and other parts of the world across the globe and over time. So the concern would be to focus on contemporary issues, but also trace those contemporary issues to historical processes. And finally, I think a word about students. I have been teaching at the University of Washington for 13 years, and we have the unfortunate stereotype that it's a very white student population. And actually, it's quite diverse, and I have students from a very broad range of backgrounds, people who have experienced life in the Middle East, who come from very rich traditions beyond the Middle East, who are Muslim traditions. And one of the best ways I have found to get students to talk about contentious issues is to let them talk to each other, and to raise questions, to have those conversations, and actually to produce new knowledge right there in the classroom. So my teaching is based on encouraging and improving students' critical thinking capacities, their writing and listening skills, but also verbal communication skills, because I think we emphasize the others so much, but much of what students do when they get into the real world, so to speak, is talk. And so they need to be able to talk about these issues. And so these skills, I think, are crucial to offering up an important liberal arts education, and I think for our students, we need to do that.
So I do want to thank my colleagues for their insightful comments, and I also want to mention that actually Arzu is not formally in the Jackson School except for her upcoming appointment as the director, but I think she's done a marvelous job of summarizing what we mean by doing area studies in the Jackson School. The context, the history, and the ability to think about complex issues in an interdisciplinary and historical way and making it accessible and open to students. So I think altogether we have four really different and excellent and complementary insights to this issue. I will open it now to questions and comments, and we have about half an hour or so, so please. And I will repeat the questions because it might be difficult for you.
So, first of all, thank you all for coming, and thank you for having this talk today. I think in the classroom, it's a very controlled environment, and it's great that we're keeping open dialogues and opening up to critical thinking. I think people are feeling uncomfortable about what happens on the university campus outside of the classroom, and the lack maybe of moderators and moderation, both. I mean, you know what I'm saying? The dialogue then becomes heated and not respectful and not open and not, people aren't listening. There's more talking than listening going on. So how do we extend this great thing that's happening in the classroom and bring it out to the streets of the campus or the squares or?
I think the question is, it's wonderful to find out about the discussions that go on in classrooms, but the classrooms are somewhat controlled environments where professors allow these points of views to come in and interact. But such interaction may not always take place outside the classroom, on the campus. And I might add also other parts of our communities, our television, our Congress. So how do you kind of bring this kind of what I could maybe call more open and enlightened approach to these subjects to our broader communities? So who wants to? He knows the most.
You can't control it entirely. The campus in many ways is as open, as Rashad alluded to, as the television airwaves and the soapbox on the town square. So it's impossible to control it entirely. I think that in universities, though, we really do want to make some distinctions as best we can in trying to get people who have the quality of thought to begin to see what I talked about as empathy, that is, who really can delve into the issues in a multifaceted way and not come simply with a single story in an inflammatory fashion. There are no university police, thought police, who are going to enable us to ensure that that happens every time. But as a collective faculty, I think we can do our best to make sure that we're bringing quality for our students and for the general community in programs like this. And again, no guarantees, but we can do our best to try and bring those sorts of people.
I have an example. It's not Middle East related, but just an example of something that I think works. And I agree that we can't control all the debates, but we can highlight that these are debates and that maybe there are other points of view that are out there that students or others should avail themselves of. So, for instance, in this very room, on Mondays and Wednesdays, I teach a course on human rights. And I have a guest speaker coming in to talk about the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it's something, I haven't actually formulated my own opinion on it yet, but one thing that's happening with that is it's being fast-tracked through Congress with no debate. So I'm highlighting this angle of it for my students, and I'm bringing in a guest speaker who will actually hopefully highlight part of the debate for the students, which will then allow them to go out to the various media, the various sources that are out there to bring their questions to that. So that's one way that we can't shape what people think, we can't control it, but we can guide them to ask questions, to think considered thoughts about them.
Other questions? Yes.
The opposite pole of controlling these debates, how do we get partisans and in the Middle East conflict to come out and debate, as opposed to shouting down speakers that don't agree with them, forcing speakers to be uninvited from campuses, and how do we make it a more open atmosphere so that these things can be brought to the surface?
The question is, how can we get people to hear each other in a way and make sure that people who are expressing certain points of view are not shouted down and there is more of a conversation rather than shouting at each other. I'll just say one thing and I'll ask my colleagues if they want to comment on this. Because of my background and my job, I travel a lot, and I go in and out of different contexts. I follow different presses. And one thing that's becoming increasingly depressing to me is that this issue of fighting or shouting at each other is taking place everywhere, it seems. It's taking place in Chinese, in Turkish, in Arabic, in Hebrew, in everywhere. And I don't know, I think there's something that has to do with some global developments that are affecting all societies, perhaps in similar, but also in different, but also in similar ways. And that is something actually for those of us who are interested in international studies for very good reasons about understanding the world, making it a better place for our students. It's a depressing trend that I see in different places. I don't really have an answer except for encouraging people to take our classes and learn to talk to each other in our classes and hopefully go out and then make a difference. But the trend itself is something quite common and somewhat disturbing. I don't know if anybody wants to. Okay. I will not answer the other questions. Other questions? Yes.
I thought there was going to be discussion on ISIS. I heard very little mention from any of your speakers.
The discussion about ISIS.
Yes, the threat of ISIS, the ideology of ISIS.
Joel is trying to understand ISIS, he's saying. There are so many different parts of what's going on in the Middle East, and it's obviously trying to understand a phenomenon like this is it's crucial, because it's not like anything that we've been talking about. Many of the common arguments that we heard from our colleagues has to do with these national ideas that divided the Middle East into compartments and units. And that movement, of course, claims to be sort of cutting across these borders and have a different understanding of what the Middle East should be like. So it's a new phenomenon, but I don't know if Joel wants to. Or one of you, I don't know.
You want a short course on ISIS here? I don't think I can give it. Let me say something about us before I say something about ISIS. Let me preface by re-emphasizing that I think most people in this room have been horrified by the videos and the reports, by the acts of brutality that we've seen. So that's my preface to say, but I wanted to just sort of broaden the conversation a little bit and to say that one of our difficulties as Americans today in dealing with a lot of social and political issues that come before us is that these issues have been framed by the government usually in extreme terms. And what I mean by that is that it's not that we have police actions which are going to try and stem the flow of drugs from South America to the United States. We have a war on drugs. It's not that we're going to try and deal, because our national security is threatened, with a variety of issues of terrorism around the world that have affected Americans and hurt allies of Americans, but we have a war on terrorism. And these wars, it seems to me, frame issues in such a way that it becomes very difficult to penetrate them in an analytic fashion. Rather than trying to understand what's happening and what lies at the root of these issues, We rather are in a mode of combat against them. And I think this has happened with ISIS to an extent too. That the reaction to ISIS, beyond the horror, was that this is the biggest threat to American security in decades. I don't think it is. I don't think that ISIS is the kind of threat that has been blown up to be in the press. I think it does horrible, horrible things, but I don't think it's the kind of threat. And that in some ways, by making it into the threat, into the ultimate threat, we have helped feed the framing that in fact replenishes ISIS's ranks. So maybe what I'm saying is a bit extreme. I don't want to get too far out on a limb, but I think that we ought to examine ourselves too and how we're going to frame and think about and talk about these issues, and not be drawn into the war on whatever it is at the moment.
So 9/11 attack is not an issue, right? 9/11, it's not the threat to the United States. That's what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that 9/11 is not the issue. I am saying, however, that 9/11 did not necessarily have to lead to what is now a 13-year ongoing war of the United States, fought in many corners of the world, the war on terrorism. There are other ways to think about how to handle these threats. Yes?
I really enjoyed the session. Thank you all. Is it possible that there could be an echo chamber also developing within faculty, even at the most, well-rounded university here? I'm not saying it's happening here, but is that something that you have to be aware of, and as faculty, and be careful that you don't, that there doesn't tend to be a uniformity of views that coalesce around certain opinions just among faculty?
Okay. I'm not sure what I can say about this precisely, but I do think that we can, as a faculty at a university, fall prey to talking to the people that we want to talk to and that we like to talk to, and then in that interaction we begin to share ideas, and even in the selection of those opportunities to have conversations, we do end up isolating ourselves to some extent. But there is a practice in academia of putting your, publishing and putting your work out there, and we have sort of a structured way in which we garner feedback. One thing that we have been trying to do in the last 5 years under the leadership of Rashad is to have more intentional conversations around topics and ideas that we all care about deeply, but may have very different perspectives on. And I think sometimes we lose sight of prioritizing that intentionality in the everyday of grading and everything that we have to do besides think great thoughts. So I think it does require consistent, intentional leadership that gets us sitting down and having conversations with each other that maybe challenges us, and not to be so formal and performative in those presentations either, but to allow ourselves the freedom of having an unstructured, thoughtful conversation.
My impression is that there while there may be some echo chambers, I think there may be some conversations that happen over here, and there are some conversations that happen over here. And sometimes there's not so much conversation across that across those different bubbles. And I think for me that's been, I think it's been frustrating, I would say, especially when it comes to issues of the Middle East or Israel and Palestine. And I feel, given my own subjectivity, like what I teach and who I am, I think that I feel like sometimes some of my colleagues make some assumptions maybe about what my political orientation might be without speaking to me, and then I don't sometimes know, like, well, do they already think that about me? So if I say something, I'm going to confirm what they already believe, or I'm going, or am I going to be able to say, It's been a difficult, I would say, difficult kind of terrain, and so normally I justify oftentimes silence, I guess I would say, saying that I don't have tenure. So I don't want to get too involved in anything just yet, which is kind of true. I don't know if it actually is, but I don't know, that's an honest answer. I mean, I guess so.
Yes.
Having a conversation means that someone at the other end wants to listen. What do you do when they don't?
The question is, having a conversation means that there has to be someone on the other end who is willing to listen. And what do you do when they don't?
I'm gonna tell a story again. Okay.
I don't want to hear it.
So I was invited a number of years ago on a cold winter day to give a talk at the University of Michigan Hillel. And my talk was going to be on Israel and Palestinians. And for, I think, many of the reasons that Devin just alluded to, Palestinian students on campus made some assumptions about my speaking in Hillel, who I was, where I was coming from, and they picketed the Hillel building. It was a bitter, cold day, and I walked over to them, and I said, I'm the speaker. It's really cold out here. Why don't you come in and listen to me? And they did. And the Jewish Hillel students and the Palestinian students came up to me afterwards, both of them, and said, you made us think about these things in ways that we hadn't thought about before. And I don't think that's a kind of facile answer, because some people are not willing to come into the building. But I think you've got to make that effort to address the issue on other than a kind of simple partisan basis.
Yes.
Does it present any just out of curiosity, it seems a lot of the talk was centered around pedagogy. I was interested if it presents any difficulties being in a research institution where so much of the pedagogy is focused around research and things that have gone through the often multi-year process of being published. In an area where things are changing so fast, to have an up-to-date conversation, to keep your curriculum up-to-date, is there any tension there? Does that present difficulties for you as professors to have a pedagogy that's research-focused but in an area that's changing so radically overnight?
This is a very good question. I don't know if everybody heard. In terms of pedagogy, how do you keep up with the times in a way? Because you are dealing with the world, and by using different kinds of approaches, and everything is changing constantly. So how do you keep up, basically? And does that create any challenges? So.
Thank you for that question. question. That's a really helpful question, and it's actually a question that is constantly on my mind. And I'll take one example. I teach a course on women's rights in politics and Muslim societies. And so over the, since, 2002 teaching it, so much has happened, both kind of in the macro context of the regional politics and issues that influence women's rights, but also just everyday acts, like laws that were passed that change. So there is a way in which you want to present the debates from a substantive point of view and give the students some material knowledge on what's actually happening in Egypt, in Iran, or what have you. But there are also kind of the classical texts that are teaching the students something about the disciplinary approach, if you will. And so there's kind of a merger of those, at least in my syllabi. The other thing, I haven't decided yet if it's a blessing or something else, but now with the internet, we have so much at our fingertips. So back in the day, when it was just the syllabus with the books and the articles, it was kind of an enclosed situation subject to exactly what you suggested. But now we have the learning management system where we can post up-to-date videos and articles, from newspapers, blogs, and so on. So there's that in addition. My biggest problem has been getting students to do the reading. So if anyone has solutions for that.
Other questions? Yes.
How do you treat the internet? Because there's so many points of view out there.
How do you treat the internet? Because there's so many different points of view out there.
Because you have to come from somewhere, a background.
Yes.
I think the internet is very scary. I'm teaching a course on the Holocaust right now, and one of the texts that we read was, we read an excerpt of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a very infamous anti-Semitic text that imagines that Jews are taking over the world. And as I was preparing for this, I did a search for Protocols of the Elders of Zion on the internet, and I was really struck by what I discovered, which was primarily websites endorsing this this perspective. And so I think I have a few students there. I think I mentioned in one of my lectures is that please don't look at the please don't go to the internet if you're having difficulty understanding this document. And I think that there are many good things that come with the internet, of course, many perspectives. But I think, depending on the topic, you can jump down a rabbit hole and you can get really you go into some dark corners pretty quickly.
Yes.
We've heard a lot about on numerous campuses about speakers who have been canceled. UCLA, Brandeis, Davis, I believe, San Diego, for fear of violence, whatever. Has that happened here where you have speakers who you say, no, sorry, you can't come?
Not that I know of. Our approach is that this is a university, and again, going back to something I said earlier, I have lived under circumstances where there were those kinds of attempts to control who speaks, who doesn't speak, etc. And my feeling is once you start going on that route, there is really no end. And at the end, you either get a very limited perspective on issues or you don't hear anybody. So I don't know of any instance on this campus where somebody was prevented from speaking. Some speakers who come do create different kinds of reaction and protests sometimes. But as far as we're concerned, that's precisely what we are supposed to provide an opportunity for people to hear a wide range of views on issues. Now there is, of course, personally, there is a requirement that whoever speaks on behalf of the school or the university or the college has to have some academic credibility because this is a university. We do invite people who are not academics, but again, they need to have some credibility in their chosen professions. But that's in a way, it's not a very high threshold for accepting or for having forum for people. But beyond that, I am not. I mean, I do remember even going back to my first years here, some speakers creating. I mean, these are not academic, political sort of. Because of what was going on in Central America, for example, people who came from government sometimes generated a lot of reaction on this campus. But I'm not aware of anybody who was either cancelled or disinvited.
I attended an event sponsored by the Simpson Center here on this campus, and only one side was presented. And I was very concerned about that. Considering that this is a university, I thought both sides should have been allowed to present their position. And this has happened 3 times in the last 6 weeks.
Should probably talk to Hans Simpson. But also, I think, I don't want to be flippant. I mean, it's also, I think one way to think about it is looking at the university as a whole. The question is that the only point of view that's presented all the time? Can you find alternative points of view on this campus at this university at a given point in time? And I think the answer to that is yes. So it's good. One wishes that all the units on this campus provide a wide range of views, and I think most of them do. But I think we need to look at it as a campus, as a university, and I think there is sufficient diversity.
I was just curious what specific events, specific side.
The gentleman I heard was Barghouti, I think is how you pronounce his name. Barghouti.
Okay.
And there was just a woman just last week, Sarah, somebody that I was able to hear speak, just last Tuesday night.
So I think this will be the last question.
I have a question going back to the classroom. What role does the student identity play in the discussions? Do some students' background sort of validate their perspective more or less? Or how do you handle that in the classroom?
What was the question?
The question is, what role does the student's background play in discussions, basically? So I think Arzu wants to, and then others too.
Actually, I'm so glad you asked that question because there was something I wanted to say that didn't really fit in my talk. So I teach small seminars. In addition to my big human rights class, I teach several small seminars. And one thing I always say to get kind of the conversation going and as a baseline for the course is that just because somebody says something doesn't mean he or she believes it. Because that's the only way that we can get all the viewpoints. And one thing that I've noticed, again, working on Iran, a lot of times you're in your, maybe this goes to the echo chamber question, you're in your academic research contemplative setting, and then you sit next to someone on the plane and they ask you questions that are much more commonsensical in a sense, you know, like, well, if women, you know, somebody once said to me, oh, you're writing a book about women's rights, that's going to be a really short book, you know, women's rights. But so how do you talk to those people, right? So I I try to tell the students that we need to have everybody's voices, and I have students from a very diverse range of backgrounds, and I ask them to bring those into the extent that they feel comfortable. But I think I also prepare them that if they don't say what needs to be said, then I will. I'll play the devil's advocate, but I think that's the only way to get those really serious concerns on the table. I don't want to create a world in which the classroom is this really esoteric environment, and then they go home and they have these questions we didn't even talk about.
I just want to, echo, it's very, very important, and for me, I gave the example of this course on Iraq I teach, where I get veterans and refugees and students all in the same room. I think the important thing is to make sure that each and every one of those students feel free to talk. And the minute you conduct a classroom where certain people are either are excluded, or they're made afraid to express their opinions, then I think that really defeats the purpose of what education is about. I think that's really something I feel very, very strongly about. So that's very important. That's the value of a diverse classroom too, which I think we're really blessed.
Yes, I'm going to say something a little different from that, if it's okay with you.
Yes,
I do have tenure. So I teach a class, a Middle East seminar. Anybody here from my Middle East seminar? They're gone. They have a lot of reading to do.
They're going to go do their reading.
Yeah. And in that seminar, it's a year-long seminar, and in that seminar I've had Arab students, Iranian students, Muslims from other countries, Israelis, all sorts of students, a very diverse group. And actually I was talking about this with another seminar today. I agree, that we want the classroom to be a place where they feel safe in expressing their views and where they're coming from. But there's also something else going on in that classroom which is really interesting, which is that besides the culture that they bring, their identity politics or whatever you want to call it, they also have another culture, and that's the culture of the classroom. And they have been socialized, they have learned over time, coming from diverse countries, diverse backgrounds, they have learned how to do this, how to talk about these issues, how to debate them without attacking each other's person, while keeping it on the level of ideas. And I think it's the role of the teacher to help them and to facilitate that. But it's a really important part of the classroom, is the culture that is created, which allows that kind of discussion to take place.
and for the record, that's not different from what I was saying.
Let me just add another point of view in terms of the classroom culture. One of the things that we can also fall into a trap with is pointing to particular students because they represent some group or something. And it's very important in the classroom culture to recognize that we aren't going to do that we aren't going to make them put themselves, they don't have to represent, and that we might also invite other people to suggest ways in which one can think about and have empathy for and understand and present an alternative understanding of somebody else without putting that person on the spot to be the be-all, end-all. Because again, as we've said before, their narratives and their stories are complex, and their identities transitory sometimes, or very fixed but quite complicated. So I think that's the other piece of the classroom that we need to be aware of.
Well, with that, I do want to thank all of you for coming and the panelists for participating. I also want to take a moment to thank various staff in the Jackson School who worked to put this event together. So thank you all very much.